Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's video. I'm back from my summer vacation. I'm back from the summer break, and I had actually a great time. For example, finding some objects that I also recently used in some of my tutorials. You can see them here. And also, I've been visiting Blender conference again. Actually, this time I held a talk there. If you're interested in that, you can find the link down in the description below, or you can go to Blender's YouTube website and find it there. Now, coming back, not making it too long, let's actually start with a topic. So this week we are going to talk about motion vectors, how we can extract them or export them from Octane, and how we can bring them in to, for example, After Effects or Fusion Studio. So without further ado, let's grab your coffee again and let's get going. It already feels like ages I last said this, so welcome to Cinema 4D Land. Let's have a look at our small scene here. So what I did was building a toy Ferris wheel and animated it so we have something to put the motion blur on. To set up Octane to export motion vectors is exactly the same setup as if you wanted to render motion blur directly in Octane. So let's do this real quick by going to the Ferris wheel object and giving it a Octane object tag. This enables the motion blur for everything in the hierarchy. You can see it here. If your object would be bendy and flappy, you would have to set it to transform vertex, but we just have a rigid structure here, so transform is okay. Now, if we move the timeline, there's no motion blur yet because there's something really essential missing, and this is the setup from the camera. You need a Octane camera tag here as well. You find it in the same right-click menu if you're searching for that. Here it is. And then in the tag, what we need is go to motion blur, turn it on. I already have it turned on, but I haven't set it up here. My favorite is, and you know that if you watched all the tutorials of mine, the angle. Basically, this is a one-click solution to mimic the motion blur that most movie cameras are having, and therefore most movies are shot with. So now if we finally go and move our timeline, you can see now we have motion blur. To add motion vectors to our outputs, we have to go to the render settings, of course, then select Octane, and inside of Octane, go to the render AOV manager, tick it on, and go to the render AOV manager again and search for motion. Here we go, motion vector. If we double click that, we added it to the AOV lists here. If you close our windows, if you paid attention to the render in the background, it lost its motion blur. This is basically Octane being smart, because if you add your motion vector pass, it assumes that you want to do your motion blur in comp, so it stops rendering it. So let's finally have a look at our motion vector pass, and it looks something like this. And if you're now going, well, that looks rather strange, I agree. This is mostly down to the scale. This is also the point where we have to split this workflow in two distinct directions. One direction that I always follow is if you want to go with EXR and Floatingpoint, then you don't have to do anything because you can adjust that in comp later. The other direction would be a non-floating point integer-based image format like PNG, although I don't recommend PNG because it's very old and clunky in its file format, so I'd rather go with TIFF and 8-bit, for example. Other than the vast dynamic range of floating point images, for example 16 or 32-bit EXRs, but also 32-bit TIFF, 8 and 16-bit integer values are basically clamping down the information of your image to 0 to 1, so you have to make sure to fit in all the informations in your path within that range. Let's say we want to go with an 8-bit TIFF sequence. There are two questions popping up. One, how do we know that all the informations are in there and not cut off? And the others, if they're cut off, how do we fix that? The first question is very easily answered. Whenever you see a solid color, it is very likely that this vector is cut off. And to answer the second question, this is very easy to compensate. What you need to do is to roll open the render AOVs here and change the max speed inside of your motion vector path. So what you will do is to find the fastest movement in your scene, in your whole animation, and then adjust the speed so it isn't clamped anymore. If we go to 10 here, for example, we still see a solid color here. So let's go to 20 and look again. And 20 seems about right if that was the fastest frame in the scene. Let's actually go ahead and engage in that 8-bit workflow first. So we render out that frame and open it up in Fusion Studio and After Effects, and then see how we can use our motion vectors to get back our motion blur. For that, we'll also need our beauty, and we don't want to engage in a multi-layer file because we want to keep it simple so you understand what's going on. Oh, and one more thing before you render, in the main tab under color space, make sure your color space is sRGB. And welcome to After Effects land. Let's drag in our images and then use one of them, for example our beauty, to create our composition. Here we go. Make sure the motion vector is part of the same composition. You can see it here. Let's move it down so we have our beauty in front. Now, to my knowledge, After Effects doesn't have a built-in tool to use motion vectors to create motion blur, so what we need to do is go to the side from Revision Effects and then go with the Real Smart Motion Blur plugin. Unfortunately, this is a paid plugin, so you have to basically pay for getting this effect inside of After Effects. As I usually render my motion blur, I just have installed the trial version inside of After Effects. So what you need to do is go to the beauty and then go with RSMB, which is Real Smart Motion Blur. Let it search. Here we go. And then we go with the Real Smart Motion Blur Pro vectors and drag it on. The only thing that's missing for success is pointing the plugin to the right motion vector path, which can be done here. So if we do that, you can see it working. Of course, you can also see the watermark because I'm using the demo version. Of course, you can also fine-tune and tweak by changing the strength here, for example. It's worth pointing out that motion vectors have limits. For example, it's always better to have an object in front of an alpha instead of a static background, otherwise you get artifacts on the borders. And this is one of the reasons I like to render my motion blur mostly. And welcome to Fusion Land. It has a nice ring to it, I think. So let's bring in our images here, the beauty and the motion vector. Let's display the beauty and then also activate it. In contrast to After Effects, Fusion actually has its own motion vector effect. So what we can do is control space and then search for motion vector and then go with the motion vector blur here. Add it to the stream, make it visible, and plug in the vectors to it. There's nothing happening right now, and this is because the effect is basically waiting for vectors to come in a special channel of the image, which we don't have. We just have the red and green image channels. And if we do that, nothing's happening as well. This is because the scale is very low, so let's go with a whopping 100 here. And now you can see something, but it's not doing what we actually want. This is because the motion vector blur of Fusion expects real vectors. So what we have right now is basically that everything is centering around middle gray, but real vectors actually center around a 0 value and go in both positive and negative direction. So we have to somehow mimic that here. Of course, I tried this before, so what I want to do is go with a brightness and contrast, because this one has a lift. So if we make it visible and lift it down by -1, we basically shift the gray value back to black. If we look at our motion vector, you can see that it's sort of working, but only sort of. First of all, let's make the intensity a little bit less intense, like this. Then you can see the last sector here isn't working. And if we go back to our vectors, this is the one that's supposed to be in the negative range. So those values in the image are being clamped, which I first didn't understand because Fusion always worked in Floatingpoint and therefore should get the values right, until I noticed that our input images are of course 8-bit. So if I go to the import section and the depth and force it to 16-bit float, then go back, now you can see, yes, now finally it's working. Let me explain what was happening here with the float values. Basically, whenever you bring in something to Fusion and attach nodes to it, the settings of the initial node will be inherited by the next one. And since we input a 8-bit image, all the following nodes in the stream were also calculating stuff on 8-bit basis. And as we established before, 8-bit is clamping values from 0 to 1, so when we shift something in the negative range, it will be then clamped to 0. So forcing the input to float will also make all the following nodes respect that, and therefore being able to store negative values and in the end make the motion blur work. And welcome back to Cinema 4D. Let's set this up for a floating point EXR workflow. So we go back inside of our render settings, Octane and main, and set the color space from sRGB to either linear sRGB, or if you're in an ACES workflow, to ACES. I'm going with linear sRGB right now. Then hit the Render AOV Manager tab and go to the format and change it to EXR. 16-bit is okay. Let's compress it a little bit further. I always like the DWAB compression. Then we're good to go, I think. Of course, here we could set the max speed back to 1, but since you already set it, I think that will be okay as well. Because we just had it open, let's start with Fusion this time and drag in our images here. This time those are EXRs, and if we display them, they're a little bit dark because this is linear sRGB, but I have loaded a lookup table that converts them into the sRGB color space. Now if I steal the motion vector from our other setup, plug everything in correctly, because we already set up the strength and the color channels, then it should just work out of the box as is. And we can see, yes, it does. So with floating point images, they come in just as Fusion is expecting it, and therefore it's very easy in Fusion to get there. And welcome back to AfterEffects. Before we go anywhere else, let's make sure our comp is 32-bit. Otherwise, we can't take advantage of our EXRs. So let's bring those in and then make a comp with our beauty as before, like this. And you can see it's not too dark. So unlike Fusion, AfterEffects recognizes that it's a linear 32-bit image and compensates for that. Now, bringing in the motion vectors can lead to some strange results. Because we saved in DWAB, it will just display black in AfterEffects. And this can lead to some confusion and to head scratching whether the scene is broken. Basically, this is just a small mismatch in channel naming, so to correct that, we can use the EXtractoR and therefore assign the right channel names to the channel. Basically, AfterEffects expects capital letters while those channels are stored in small letters instead. And here we go, we have our channels back. Now, because we used an effect on the image, this will not work with real smart motion blur, so we have to pre-compose this sequence here. So let's go to Layer and then actually pre-compose, and we want to move the effect with it. Here we go. Let's move it underneath the beauty, then go to the effects and search for real smart motion blur, go with the bro vectors again here, and then just select it from the drop-down list. And you can see it's sort of wild. So the easy answer is that in contrast to Fusion, Real Smart Motion Blur likes its vectors to revolve around a middle gray value, so we have to basically alter this channel to do that. Fortunately, this is not too complicated. All we need is a solid, so let's create one with a value of 0.5. So what you can do is type 0.5 everywhere, then click OK, and then last but not least, add it to the former result. And if we now go back to our main comp, you can see, wow, it is already working. Now, remember that we set the max speed of our motion vector path inside of Cinema 4D before we export it. If we hadn't, then it wouldn't work right now. And this is because we needed to get the path into a 0 to 1 range. But the answer to that is also rather simple. So before we add, we basically need to lose some energy. So the easiest way to do that is with the transparency. Just lower the transparency until you get everything non-clipping. This of course reduces the blur amount in our main comp, but you can easily compensate for that with the blur amount of the plugin. Thank you very much for watching this long. As you know me, there often is a bonus, and so there is in this episode as well. If you decided to render float and comp in After Effects but don't want to do the layer shenanigans every time, I have something for you. We can use Octane's internal compositing system to do the same. What we need to do is go to the nodes, then to render AOVs, then click on Octane render here, and then on the output AOV compositor. Since it's always a little bit of hassle to set up something from scratch, we have a trick here. We can use one of those presets, and I mostly use the wire and main one. So if we hit apply, you can see that the nodes have been created, and we can work with those now. First of all, let's delete the wire node because we don't need it. And instead of the beauty, I want to add the motion vector by going to the info passes and then search for the motion vector like this. Since this node doesn't have an opacity like in After Effects, we need to figure out something else. And I know exactly what I'm going to do. Of course, I'm going to use a solid color here and bring it in as the second layer and multiply it. So now if we multiply, if we find it and change the color, you can see this basically controls the extent of our vectors. And already, last but not least, what we need to do is add our 50% gray value, and we are going to use the solid color for this as well. Let's plug it in here. Be careful where you set the 50%. We can't set it inside of the color picker of Cinema 4D. We have to set it in Octane's values because those are linear. Now, this is still set to multiply, so instead we have to set it to add. Here we go. This is looking quite strange, and this is because we are not looking at it linearly. So if we go to a linear representation, then it's more close to what we've seen in After Effects. Last but not least, let's go to the solid color here and set this value to 0.4 to mimic exactly the 40% of transparency that we had in After Effects before. And welcome to After Effects for one last time in this episode. So what I'm going to do is bring in the out1 in here. This is basically the comp that we just did in Octane. Let's go to the comp in After Effects that we did and bring it in here to compare. And you can see that it is lighter. This is because it comes in linearly, and After Effects doesn't know that it's just a helper pass and not a beauty image. So we need to tell it that by going to Interpret Footage, then go to Color and say that we would like to preserve the RGB values. If we do so, then toggle between the version that we did in After Effects and the one that comes from Octane, we get the exact same result. And obviously this also goes for the result as well. So we have basically made what we did before in After Effects now in Octane. So if you're rendering float and comping in After Effects and need those finalized motion vectors, then you can just copy those nodes from one Cinema 4D project to the next, and therefore always receive the nice motion vector pass that you just need to interpret and then can simply plug into your real smart motion blur without any hitches. Alrighty, that was it for this week. Thank you very much for joining back in after the long break. Hopefully you liked it. Let's thank those people who made this video possible. Of course, my Patreons. Especially my €50 tier subscribers, Shields Augustinen and Leon Studio TV. Also, of course, a huge thank you for my €15 tier subscribers, Doyim, For Die Thieves, Adam Sen, Alessio De Vecchi, Ami Schiedried, Christian Grajewski, Daniel Fakos, Graham Bucknell, Grigoris Morikis, Joel Muckemer, John Edward, Chris Clemson, Ness Graphics, Nico Straub, Part 1 of 2, Ralf, Random Capybara, Raiko, Shiro 2049, Sue Shag, Terry Wayne Ranson, Jan Verbeke, and Yassin Rupp. Hello and a very warm welcome to this first after show party in this season here. Not much has changed, so thank you very much for sticking with me that long. Hopefully you liked it. What I've been thinking about more and more lately are those YouTube channels that don't have a release cycle, but they edit or they produce videos and they're finished when they're finished. And I thought about maybe this was something for me and this channel as well. So basically to produce even higher end tutorials and higher end showcases, not weekly, but when they're finished. So my question to you is, would you be into something like that, or are you more interested in keeping a weekly schedule? Let me know and write it down in the comments below. Again, an unintentional rhyme here. While you're at it, let me know that you watched this by putting a Ferris wheel emoticon in the comments as well. And as always, I wish you a great early week, a fantastic time ahead, and happy vectoring. Bye!